Good evening, I'm Louise Wood, and on behalf of all of us here at the Dulwich Festival, welcome to tonight's conversation between Danny Dorling and Aditya Chakrabortty. Before I introduce tonight's fantastic speakers, I'll mention just a couple of practical points. So firstly, please don't record or take photographs of this event. And if you have any technical difficulties, please use the chat box on your screen and we'll try to resolve them. And finally, but really importantly, we would really love to hear your questions tonight, and you can submit them at any time tonight using the Q&A box on your screen. So let me introduce you to our panelists, and it is such a pleasure. Firstly, a welcome back in praise of Danny Dorling. Those aren't my words, but words of The Guardian's editorial in April 2010. I'm sure, Danny, those haunt you still. Where to start in praise of Danny Dorling? Well, Danny is the Halford Mackinder Professor of Geography and a Fellow of St. Peter's College, Oxford. Though he's lived in England all his life, his worldview is anything but myopic. And along with a huge variety of collaborators, he's given us more than a dozen books, hundreds of talks, and hundreds of journal papers. In many different ways, all of these challenge us to see the effects of Britain's striking inequality on poverty and politics, on health and on housing, on employment and on education. What shapes our life chances next to those of our fellow countrymen or next to those of other countries? If you want proof that Danny hits the zeitgeist, then just look at his recent publications. Slow Down, Why It's Good for the Planet, the Economy and Our Lives. Britannia, Brexit and the End of Empire with Tomlinson. And also a book we really need now, Fintopia, What We Can Learn from the World's Happiest Country, with Kolodzian, I think. You can correct me on that, Danny. In this era of unreliable information, Danny's work has been to uncover the hard data that helps us understand the shaping of our society. Where it doesn't exist, he's created the information bases, such as with his world-breaking World Mapper tool, where territories are resized on maps according to the subject of interest. And he has made these resources open access via worldmapper.org and using his own website. As a young man growing up in Oxford, Danny was employed as a play worker in children's summer play schemes. And he says that he's absorbed the ethos of preschool education, which is that playing is learning for living. And he tries hard not to forget this. Aditya Chakrabortty is the senior economics commentator for The Guardian, where he writes a regular column and reports around Britain and around the world. In 2017, Aditya won the British Journalism Award for Comment Journalist of the Year, and his work has also won a Social Policy Association Award and a Harold Wincott Prize for Business Journalism. Before joining The Guardian in 2007, he worked for the BBC as the economics producer, covering economics for the 10 o'clock news and making films for Newsnight. He's now a regular broadcaster on radio and television, and you might have seen him on Newsnight or Question Time. A recent article by Aditya ends with just one impassioned single word, enough. And I think that tells you a lot about him. But I would really recommend the piece he wrote last year about his inspiring mum, Arati, whose life was both unique, but also resonant of many others who brought with them to this country a huge love of public service. Aditya is working on his first book to be published soon by Penguin, and perhaps we'll hear a little bit about that later. So Danny Dorling and Aditya Chakrabortty, welcome to the Dulwich Festival, and over to you.
Thank you very much. Before I started writing columns for The Guardian, I was a leader writer, and I may have had a hand in that in praise of Danny Dorling, which tells you that it won't be too much of a confrontation between us this evening. Louise has relieved me of the opportunity to embarrass Danny too much, but I do just want to have a go before we start talking properly. I'm particularly pleased to be talking to Danny this evening because to me he represents a rather paradoxical figure of the kind that we need in public life at the moment. He's an academic who's not at all afraid of engaging in public life and indeed in the day-to-day of politics. He's a left-winger who's also resolutely optimistic. And he's someone who also throws himself into technical solutions, which seem sometimes incredibly obscure, but if you follow them through to their conclusion, they have very, very radical implications. There's also a particular thing. He's a geographer at a time when British politics seems to rediscover geography after decades in which we were told that geography didn't matter, that the world is flat and all of that. Now we hear about levelling up, about London versus the rest and so on. And Danny, I'd like us to start there if we could. We're a week on from the election results coming in last week. And one of the persistent themes in the commentary after the results has been that Labour in particular, the Labour Party which you follow particularly closely, that Labour is too focused on, shall we say, Dulwich and West Norwood and not enough on Darlington. And with that, there's often a particular kind of set of moral judgments about what those places are like, what Dulwich is like versus Darlington. How do you as a geographer feel about that?
It's fascinating, I think. I think the Labour Party has been in one crisis or another since I first knew it when I was 15, 16. I think I actually joined at that age. And this was in the 1980s. And I grew up in Oxford, so I joined Oxford East then. And then in 1986, I moved to Newcastle upon Tyne, and I tried to join the Labour Party there, but I walked into a Labour club in Newcastle, and everybody put their beer down, and it went silent, and I quietly got out. I was a southerner, and it was kind of obvious. But this party has actually been in one crisis or another for my entire memory. The Tony Blair years, he might have won elections, but it wasn't a happy political party at that time with what he was doing. The geography is remarkable. So, and as a geeky student, I typed in the 1950, 1951, 55, 59, 64, 66 elections, 1970, 74. Twice I had to type those numbers in. 79. Anyway, I'm sorry, geek. What did all those election numbers show us? What they showed us was that geographically over that time, voting became more and more segregated. The Tory vote rose and rose in the southeast. The Labour vote became more solid in the north. The segregation index of voters became steeper and steeper and steeper. And actually that carried on, I think, all the way to about 2010. Then there's a little wobble in 2015. 2019, then these elections, we're actually seeing that geographical segregation reducing. So famously, the Red Wall, as it's called, I think particularly unhelpful phrase, but anyway, the Red Wall, and much more quietly, Conservative losses in the south of England. That solidness is going. So for some reason, I'm sure we'll come make up the reason afterwards, but I didn't predict it would happen. The actual geographical segregation of voting in the country is reducing, and now has reduced for several general elections and definitely in the most recent local elections. Something's going on out there, a big structural change, a change in a pattern that had not changed direction for 50 or 60 years of ever growing polarization before then. Sorry, it's very academic, but
you want to, I mean, you would say that you could come up with a reason sometime afterwards, but do you want to hazard some guesses as to why that's happening?
Oh, I'm always willing to have a go at that. So, and anybody watching this who studies these things will be very annoyed with me because they all have their own parts that really matter. But anyway, this is mine. December 2019, what really mattered was that 1.2 million Labour voters didn't vote. That is by far the most important thing. I'll never forget, just to give you one bit of anecdote, an old friend of mine in Oxford, I asked him how he was going to vote, and he said, I'm not going to vote for that Corbyn. I've voted Labour all my life, but I'm not going to vote for Corbyn. And I said to him, how did you vote in 2017? He said, I voted Labour, of course. And I was being nice. I didn't tell him who the leader was. But anyway, you know, something happened between 2017 and 2019 to make a particular set of old people think that voting for Labour was a terrible thing to do, and they didn't vote. The red wall seats, as they've been called, often have names associated with poverty. There was a list in the Telegraph newspaper straight after the election, and I took the Telegraph's list and I had a look at each, and each one had 3 areas of affluence in it. That's neighbourhoods in the richest fifth of the country, in places with names like Rother Valley, you know, so that you associate these. But there's suburban, often partly rural, retirement areas, old, and that was part of what was going on with the Red Wall. It certainly wasn't Liverpool. It wasn't the middle of Sheffield. This was the outer suburbs of parts of the north. And similarly in the south, the concentration of wealth and power that had gone on for a long time, they never had it so good, the loads of money, 80s, 90s, come to an end. Now you go to something like Bracknell Newtown, which I think 40 of its 41 wards return a Conservative local councillor, despite the fact that it's a new town and mainly kind of in effect ex-council houses. People can't get housed because the houses have been sold under right to buy. There are terrible problems in Conservative areas. And for Boris Johnson in particular, he may be able to kind of sell a story to parts of the north. You know, you vote for us and you'll get some money. It'll be $1 million. That sounds like a lot of money, you know, $1 million. But for areas that have been ruled by Conservatives for decades, it's much harder to convince them that actually something amazing is going to happen. And also I do wonder, I hope people are better than this, but I do wonder when people in the south hear that monies are going to be spent in the north, they might think, wow, you know, what have I been voting for all these years then? The whole point of voting Tory was to make sure that Berkshire was okay, wasn't it? So sorry, be a bit trite. You know, we won't know, but a turning point is quite odd. A turning point has happened in voting, only just. You know, it's just over the tipping. We're not heading, you know, towards an incredible. The south goes Labour and the north goes Tory, but I've drawn these graphs for years and boringly shown the segregation increasing each election. 83 more segregated than 79, 87 more than 83, 92 more than 87, and so on. You know, it had to stop at some point, but it stopped a few elections ago, and something different is going on. The other really important thing is we're still a really odd, undemocratic country. You know, first past the post is not a democracy. Hardly anywhere runs, and I wouldn't actually, I'd use a word other than election for it. You know, it's not, in the majority of constituencies, a minority of people who vote get the person they want. You know, it's a bizarre system. And that has a huge effect on our voting and our behaviour. We can't actually vote for who we really want to vote for at general elections. And we can't even have political parties we want, because they have to, you know, the Labour Party has to be this enormous coalition. Yeah. Whereas in a normal European country, of which there are dozens, you know, when we talk about Europe, remember there are many, many, many countries in Europe, and you have different parties so that you can have a party, you can have the right kind of green party for you if you're in Germany. You know, if you don't like a particular kind of green politics, you don't have to have that green party. So we are in this odd position that is a kind of anachronism. Very few places in the world are not yet democracies, but we are, in that sense, not really a democracy yet.
What do you make of the kind of the moral judgment that goes along with this kind of geographic division in politics in the moment, the London versus the rest of the country? So when people talk about Labour's core vote as they define it at the moment, they say, oh, it's London and it's university towns. Well, you come from Oxford and you're back teaching there now, and Oxford isn't all the covered market and Christchurch, right? No. I come from London, and the part of London that I come from now has a child poverty rate of just under 50%. So it's not like all these places are bursting with affluence, just like you said, not every single part of the so-called red wall is all, you know, people on unemployment benefit. What's going on with this kind of remoralization of geography?
Oh, and all those red wall seats, none of them have the number of homeless people dying on the streets that Oxford has.
Right. Yeah.
You know, none of them have that kind of poverty. But you associate, well, Islington would be another example. People associate Islington with wealth.
Yeah.
Just the ignorance of the geography. They associate graduates with being a highly educated minority. Half of all young people go to university, 60% of young women. So you see these ridiculous graphs showing that better educated people are more likely to vote Labour. It's got nothing to do with being better educated, it's age. Your qualifications above all else are key to how old you are. If you left school at 14, that tells what age you are. Not that you were stupid or whatever, but most people did. I went to an average school, a normal school, not poor, not rich, absolutely average, which meant that only 2% of us went to university, because that's what happened in an average school in 1986, 1 in 50, right? So there was nothing strange about not going to university. 98% of people from an average school did not go to university. It says a lot, I think, about people on the left and their anxiety and carefulness. There's a care on the left, that people want to be kind. They don't want to upset other people. They don't want to be narcissistic or arrogant. So they're very worried about other people's feelings. And this results in this sort of terrible fear of, oh, this is supposed to be a working class party. And I'm not very working class. So I should say, and I'm going to give you an example of this left-wing sensibility. I'm going to explain to you that the reason I say class is because I lived for 10 years in Newcastle. And it's very hard to live in Newcastle because they don't pronounce Newcastle right. And that. But you see, I've got it. Whereas a Tory, to generalise, but in general, a Tory on the right would have no worries about their accent. You can tell they don't. You know, they're deliberately keeping some of the snobbery of an accent that they would otherwise lose. And that kind of idea of worrying so much about upsetting other people, that generally isn't there on the right of politics. And you see the same in the USA. This argument within the left about the morality of it, I think, shows part of the problem that the left has and has had for a very long time. There's a lovely book called something like A Socialist Melancholy in the Victorian age, about how the first socialists seem to always suffer from depression and anxiety. And it's an issue of left and green politics worldwide, and a characteristic of it. Whereas on the right, discipline, hygiene, health, hierarchy, leadership, working together, and certainly the idea that you would be worried about what people thought of you. You know, you'd only be worried if they actually heard you say, I don't care if the bodies pile up. You wouldn't be worried about saying that the bodies are going to pile up. It's very, our politics, and not just in Britain, is very polarized over who actually cares and is emotive, and who really doesn't care and is willing to drive through. And I think left-wing politics and activism attracts people who are more sensitive, which might explain why they bother doing it. Conversely, on the right, people who are actually less sensitive, more willing to step on other people's necks, are more likely to be there.
I do wonder if something else is not going on at the moment as well, which is that the right, which now sees its electoral opportunities in those what used to be thought of as Labour heartlands, although whether they always were is more debatable. But the right are actively employing this moral language about London and North because they want to win the North, right? So it's better to make out that the North is full of these innocent, pure-hearted voters who have suddenly had the scales dropped from their eyes, whereas London and Oxford and Cambridge, full of these incredibly cynical young people eating vegan burgers or whatever it is we're meant to be doing. So I wonder if a bit of that is going on. And it also makes me wonder what you make of the actual policies that Boris Johnson and his government are now proposing that they're going to offer these new voters. You talked a bit about the Towns Fund and the kind of £1 million of pork here, £1 million of pork there, but there is an agenda they keep talking about of levelling up.
Mm.
How seriously are we meant to take it?
Well, we should recognise that when Margaret Thatcher was in power, which was from 79 to 90, the economic fortunes of the best off third, maybe best off 40% of the population did get much better than the rest. That's the great increase in inequality was all about the top third, 40%, seeing their real incomes double. Okay. Ever since then, the proportion of voters who've actually benefited when the Conservatives have been in power has got smaller and smaller and smaller. So under Cameron, it really was only the top 1 or 2% who were actually getting better off over time. This means the Conservative Party have had to get more and more clever at lying to people, telling them that we make your lives better and we will make your lives even better in the future. Oh, and anything that made your life worse, well, that was due to the last time that Labour were in power, no matter how long ago that was. And they're much better at it now than, Thatcher actually did preside over a period where people who voted for her, odds on, got better off. That hasn't been true since. Levelling up. Okay, I've been looking at the levelling up formula. I won't bore you, but it's the most Machiavellian. So the funding, that the farther away an area is from a settlement of 5,000 people, the more likely you are to get money. That's one of the main drivers of levelling up. So it's money for rural areas, particularly isolated rural areas, in other words, national parks. North Yorkshire, Herefordshire. It's almost beggars belief how open this kind of it's almost as if somebody got really bored and thought, rather than making it even seem sort of semi-plausible, I will create a methodology to move this money not to areas that actually need it. And it's not a lot of money anyway. What huge problem in Britain is that we don't understand the difference between £1 million and £1 billion. And you'll find this hard when you're writing things and writing stories to explain the difference. And if we ever divided it by the population, it becomes easier.
Yeah.
But there's no... So levelling up, the phrase itself, is a ridiculous phrase because it implies we're going to get everywhere up to the height of the highest, which in terms of, I don't know, GDP per head is Kensington and Chelsea, and an average income of £100,000 for everybody. It's Margaret Thatcher's tall poppies, but we're going to make everybody a tall poppy. There's almost a degree of insulting in the actual phrase. It's so ridiculous. I should try and think of a sort of better three-word phrase that they could have done. But it's effective so far. How long? But they'll find another phrase, another 2 or 3, help to buy, take back control. We should expect, Dominic Cummings is not the only person who can create 2 or 3 word, slightly banal phrases, and then you repeat them. But targeted to the hopes and fears and aspirations, particularly of older people, particularly around retirement age. You can vote Conservative. We will look after your pension. We will look after the value of your property because that's the most important thing you have. But we're also going to say some nice things about what we'll do for other people so that when your grandchildren might mutter to you, why do you vote Conservative, Grandad? You can say, but they're doing these good things, aren't they? They're building hospitals in Teesside, apparently, 40. There's 40 hospitals that Boris went on about?
Yeah.
They're going to have to be built somewhere at some point. They might be very small, but, so it's partly a kind of conscious easing thing, because a slight worry that some of the loyal voters might become less loyal if there's pressure from family and friends. To do it differently, but also trying to pull in some more votes from people who might be wavering. Who wants to vote for the nasty party of snakes in suits?
Oh, yeah. Can I just encourage people? I can see that there are a few questions now trickling in. I'd really encourage you to chuck your questions in. I might well start throwing them at Danny as we go along, rather than waiting necessarily until the end. There's something that you just said, Danny, which made me think. You were talking about the 3-word phrases, and it struck me that actually that's not the only thing that the Johnson government or Johnson and Dominic Cummings were particularly good at. They were also very good at the sums of money which sounded almost relatable. So the £350 million per week on the side of the bus, for instance, the talking about a towns fund where you get £1 million to your constituency, or the 40 hospitals up and down the country. There is a potency to those figures which sound like they're almost within reach. They're certainly more easily computable than $1 billion or $1 trillion. And I've noticed this myself in journalism, that, for instance, you remember the banking crisis of 2008-9, when the UK government, among others, kind of threw trillions at the banking sector in kind of upfront cash, loans, guarantees, all the rest. And there were so many trillions that I'd go to constituency Labour Party meetings and try and explain what had just happened. You talk about trillions, people's eyes glaze over. Yeah. So I went away and I thought, okay, this doesn't work. And I did some really basic back of the envelope kind of maths, and I worked out that actually it amounted to the level of government support had amounted to something close to £20,000 for every man, woman, and child in Britain. So the next CLP meeting I went to speak at, I said, how do you feel about lending me 20 grand? You know, I'm a banker. I'm not going to make you any guarantees. All of a sudden, the trillions, which had no ice whatsoever, were much less potent than this figure of 20 grand, because people would kind of imagine what 20 grand was like, right?
Yeah.
What's surprising to me about that is, again, it's the right which have mobilized that kind of rhetoric, and the left.
Well, I think it fits back to what you began with about the moral and the emotive thing on the left. The left don't want to talk down to people. I think there's a famous phrase, I don't know from no one there, Cooper, never talk down to the working class. It's one of these kind of things you're not allowed to do. Don't talk to people as if they don't get it. So we might talk about a real terms increase in health spending. Okay, not 40 hospitals, but a real terms increase in health spending. The left has been abysmal about this. So in the manifesto for 2019, the spending plans for Labour were to bring spending as a whole almost, but not quite, within 0.1% of Germany. Germany spends, this is one little jump, and this is part of the problem about the left, you weigh back your slight jumps and caveats. But Germany spends 1,050,000,000, I think pounds equivalent, on health a week more than we do. That's exactly 3 times 350 million. So Labour should have got 3 buses. 3 buses, each with 350 on it. And for 6 months before 2019, driven around and said, you know, our increasing public spending will mean 3 times as much as the Conservatives have promised, to German levels, not the really high levels, which is Switzerland, you know, or Finland, but actually just to German levels of health spending.
But you know what would happen then, Danny? They'd have said Jeremy Corbyn, that horrible gas guzzler, driving around in his 3 buses.
Yeah. Oh, then they'll just say he's lying to you, and they would find it out. We got to remember, just as they were effective on saying 40 hospitals rather than a real terms increase in health spending. 40 hospitals, of course, is a big reduction in health spending.
Right.
They were also extremely good at attacking their opponents. They pulled Jeremy Corbyn apart. Now, and you could pull anybody apart like that if you choose to and want to. And the left on the other side were kind. We don't want to mention somebody's personal, you know, relationships with children or anything, or, you know, because we don't do that, because we're nice people on the left. You know, so no going in for the jugular on, you know, do you know that this man said he would have somebody else beaten up? And let's just go into great detail about that episode from 20 or 30 years ago. None of that kind of below the belt stuff. Particularly, it has to be said, I think Jeremy Corbyn, who I like, epitomizes this. You know, I will not go there. I will not help drag. Well, in the sewer of politics, he was there saying, I will not behave like 95% of you, which, very nice and laudable and great for the history books. But, at some point...
totally right. I mean, completely. There are aspects of Corbyn's rhetoric, which is like shredded wheat in an era of Cheerios. Like, you wonder why on earth you're doing it. Listen, Danny, let me chuck you a couple of questions which have come in. I'm going to read you one from someone who's bravely called themselves anonymous attendee, which will tell you what kind of question it's going to be. Would Danny ever vote Conservative? And let me pair that with another question. This is from Mike Marriott. Levelling up. He's talking about the swizz of levelling up. Don't we instead need to talk about the rich having to level down and share their goodies? Those two.
Okay, let's take the latter, the easier one first. I think we need to talk about the selfishness and the hoarding of a very small number of people. I think you could probably do it at about 1%, the top 1%. And you could talk about that behaviour, owning 3 homes, the paying your servants, of which there are more and more servants in Britain, paying your servants an absolute pittance because you actually enjoy paying them so little, not because it's, I think we do need to talk about that behaviour at the very top. And levelling that down because it creates a problem for everybody else. That's on the sort of negative side. On the positive side, you can start to talk of things like, how do we get enough housing for people to actually be able to start a family? And there are ways of doing that that don't necessarily require building much housing, because we have an enormous amount of housing which is underused with a single elderly person in it, who's there because there's nowhere else for them to really go, and they are holding on to the money for their family to pass on. So, I think you do the negative and the angry stuff about people who are really badly behaved. You don't be as kind as Corbyn necessarily was, because people are dying from this behaviour. So the one reason why we have so many people on the streets in Britain, more than any other European country apart from Germany, and Germany only had as many because of the Syrian refugees. Can you imagine us letting 1.5 million refugees in? 1.5 million. The reason why you have these terrible situations is the greed of some people. Could I ever vote Conservative? I could in Germany. I could vote for Merkel. I wouldn't necessarily. I can guess what party I'd probably go for, but Merkel's government, their actual policies, they're having trade unionists on boards, the rules over football clubs. It was actually to the left of Corbyn. I could vote Conservative in Finland. I met a lovely Conservative mayor in Finland. He was to the left of Corbyn, but a Conservative politician. And in some kind of fantasy world in Britain in 50 or 100 years, possibly. It doesn't always stay the same. We are at an absolute extreme. In some ways, we shouldn't call our Conservatives conservative, because they stopped being Conservatives in 2014. In 2014, David Cameron took the Conservative Party out of the European Conservative bloc, which is the EPP. This was incredibly important, and we didn't notice it, and joined an alliance which included Alternative for Deutschland as actually part of their alliance in the European Parliament. So our Conservative Party became a far-right party at that point. When we left the European Parliament, we had the highest number, 40-odd, far-right MEPs, UKIP and Tory. That was devastating for the far-right of Europe, that huge bloc leaving. Now it's roughly 20 Polish far-right MEPs are the bedrock of the far-right in Europe. And we just don't think of ourselves like that. We didn't realise our Conservative Party had moved to the far right. Our Labour Party had become a Conservative Party under Blair. Even under Corbyn, it was just a mild-mannered social democratic party that wasn't brave enough to do what Merkel did in Germany. We had shifted step by step over decades, more and more rightwards. And you don't see it because you think of yourself, or put it another way, if you think of Europe as the United States of America, we became the Texas of Europe. That kind of, gunslinging, arrogant, Jeb Bush voting place. And just as Texas thinks of itself as normal, we, particularly in England, thought that we're normal, they're strange.
Okay, I want to ask you one more question, because I think this will serve as or I'm going to ask you one more question for now, rather, because I think this will serve as quite a good transition. It's from Richard Leeming, and he asks, will we ever feel the impact of Brexit, or has it been completely blanked by COVID?
COVID's just the kind of thing you need to, the timing was pretty spot on. And, so what if it's harder to get goods across from France, because currently you're not allowed to get anything across from France. So that certainly had an effect. But that's just to dull our immediate reactions to it. And, to hand the Conservatives their dues, if COVID hadn't come along, I'm sure they would have thought of some other things to distract us. Hopefully not a war, but, a small country somewhere, but hopefully not that. But when Margaret Thatcher was doing badly in the early 1980s, there was a convenient, and we could be very patriotic about it. But COVID obviously has a far greater effect. I think it'll be noticed. I think it'll be fairly obvious in years to come, simply when people produce graphs that compare the economies and the living standards of people in France and Germany, and Spain and Italy with us, and look at the divergence over time, and then say, what was it that, and Brexit will be one of the reasons. But already, in a sense, the reason I'm saying this with some confidence is that already our median household income was well below France and Germany's.
Right.
And our cost of housing was higher.
Yeah.
Our life expectancy was lower. There were many, many things where we were doing worse than large mainland European countries already, but we weren't generally aware of that. Whereas in future years, as that becomes really obvious, probably more of it will be blamed on Brexit than fair, by Remainers like me who say, oh, if it hadn't been for Brexit. I'll give you one last stat on this. Infant mortality, neonatal infant mortality. When I was born in the late 60s, we were one of the best countries in the world. We had the first baby incubators and so on. So we were nearly ranked one. Now let me try and get this right. By 1990 in Europe, we were ranked 7. 6 countries had a lower neonatal mortality rate, but all the rest were worse. And at rank 7, and that's also 7th in the world, is really good.
Right.
That ranking from 1990 dropped to, I think, 17th by 2015. That was the biggest drop of any country in Europe in terms of relative child health. So the rate still gets better, but all the rest of Europe, 17 countries, got better much faster. And then after 2015, we actually saw small rises in neonatal mortality, whereas everywhere else they're dropping. So we are almost next to Romania for our neonatal mortality rates. We're at the bottom end of the European League table, next to some very poor Eastern European countries. Now, we don't think of ourselves like that, but those statistics, you can't fool people forever. And very kindly, the European Commission keeps us in their statistical tables, right? We're no longer in the main block. We're in the bottom, along with Russia and some other odd countries. But the numbers are kept there. So these comparisons that will be made in future, I think it's already getting worse, and Brexit will make it worse. But the reason I'm quite confident about this is because we were already doing pretty badly. Of course, to be fair to Brexiteer, they'll say the whole point of Brexit was that it's going to turn us round, and within, what was it George Osborne said? George Osborne said if we followed his economic plan, you might remember this, then by the year 2030, we will become the richest large economic nation on the world as measured by per capita GDP.
Right.
That's only 9 years away, isn't it? And the Brexiteers, they're Empire 2.0 and so on.
Let me ask you just a bit specifically on COVID. We're coming to the end of the lockdown in the UK, if they continue along the roadmap. What kind of lasting impact will it have, in particular on the cities? You know, we both live in cities where extremely expensive flats are being knocked up in the centre, where to some extent it was thought that the future direction in the entire country lay in the cities. This government is now briefing that actually doesn't want to go down that path, but it also sits alongside a moment when, in general, people are thinking, do I really want to commute? Do I really want to live in the centre of city? What after a year and a bit, what kind of lasting impact do you think all of this has had?
This is going to be hard. I mean, most of the previous pandemics we've had have not had a lasting impact. Well, you have to go back to cholera. And cholera, we put in sewer systems. You know, there was, well, that was partly devious. That was some very nice Victorian epidemiologists convincing the upper classes that they were as much at risk as the lower classes, and anyway, and that helped us get sewer systems in. But my gut feeling is that the effects will not be as big as we think they will be. The return to normal will be somewhat faster than we currently expect. We will keep jumping incredibly nervously when there are 10 cases appearing somewhere, or 300 in Bolton, or a story of a new variant. The degree of nervousness will last for some people the rest of their lives. But I suspect the return to something like normal will be faster than people expect, even including Canary Wharf and those lifts being used again. Right. The lifts became unusable in Canary Wharf. The idea of squeezing people into that lift. Right. We will have increased working from home, not least because that saves the bosses quite a lot of money, as long as you've got a job where they can control what you do and measure what you're doing. That will rise. But I think the biggest we're seeing little effects in the housing market, but there will also be influence. You know, a lot of people have died, most of them very elderly, quite a lot of them who were owner occupiers. So quite a lot of property in those areas has gone on the market, and you know, that's partly, it's sad to say, that's part of the reason for the transactions in rural areas, but that is part of the reason. However, sorry to waffling on about this. My gut feeling about Oxford and London is that as lockdowns occur, we will notice who's left, and a lot of people who have left are Europeans, especially Eastern Europeans.
Yeah.
Who certainly for the pubs, the catering, the restaurants, the cleaning in Oxford, and the mini plant for the last manual line. And it's going to be quite a shock to realise who isn't here. And they didn't leave necessarily because of Brexit. They left because of COVID on top of Brexit, where there was no work.
Yeah.
And also, you couldn't necessarily easily get back to mum and dad or your boyfriend or girlfriend.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think that's going to be the shock for the cities, is the discovery of who has decided it's not worth being here anymore, and they're not even in the country as a whole anymore.
So just pick up on that last point and extend it a bit further. How should we feel about that? Forget about the immediate economic impact of that, which is suddenly a lot of low-paid workers have just dropped out of workforce and gone maybe to Spain or somewhere else in Europe or wherever. But what's that telling us about the kind of society that we're in? That people who've been treated pretty roughly in this country think, okay, well, these two things together mean I'm out now.
Yeah. It tells us that people who had a choice, work that out. It's possible that for everybody who has left, somebody else will come in. There's always a lower ranked country, where it's worth the chance, and there's always the streets are paved with gold, Dick Whittington attraction, and other reasons for the attractions. I was shocked by when people ask people from East Africa, countries that were never actually part of the empire, why did you trek across the Sahara, across the Mediterranean, and then walk all the way past all these actually more affluent European countries? and then try and work out how the hell you get in a dinghy across the channel to get to England.
Right.
And they say Manchester United. And that's not, but there's this terrible attracting force of a reputation still of a country with the English language and things like this. So other people will come and be asked to come. Enoch Powell went out to the Caribbean and to India to ask people to come and work the night shift and in mills and to work on the buses in the NHS. But that's even more divided society.
Right.
That's a set of people who are poorer and in some ways look down even more than our already pretty terrible states of division.
Right.
I'll never forget being in Alton Towers, where a lot of the staff in Alton Towers theme park were from Eastern Europe. And I'm very nosy and very rude. And I kept on asking people who were serving me a cup of Coke, how many university degrees have you got?
Right. Yeah.
Because the question, it really was, did you have 2 master's degrees from somewhere in the Central European University and a PhD, and you're working in Alton Towers? And that era, we've managed to, ridiculously, we had this amazing deal. The mainland of Europe educated these people, paid for their education and everything else. We took them without having to pay for that, paid them a pittance, made them live in the worst accommodation that we had because the experience was good. And it was a really unfair and quite nasty deal that we had in one way.
Yeah. I want to throw you a question which I think is directly related to it. It's from Jill Mine. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, Jill. It says, the question is, why is it difficult to get British people to do low-paid jobs in areas like hospitality? Is it low wages, or is it that we've educated people to such a high level that they won't consider those jobs? And that Jill adds in brackets, P.S. I love migrants and rely on them in the public sector.
It's difficult to get people to do low-paid jobs anywhere. And in really well-organised countries, which have low economic inequality, you have very few low-paid jobs. What that means is, in somewhere like Japan, which has low inequality, you have a machine where you get your coffee from, rather than paying somebody to sit all day behind a counter and make you coffee, supposedly because they can do it better than a machine. In somewhere like Finland, the lowest paid workers are paid twice as much as they're paid here, but also have flexible working hours. And it's quite hard. If you try and get a burger in Helsinki after 10 o'clock at night, well, I found it impossible because people aren't forced to do work that they wouldn't want to do. So what's odd about Britain is, rather than us saying, how come we've got so many thousands of people willing to be paid so little to work in care homes and to clean and all the rest of it, we actually say, why is it so hard to get them? Other places don't. More unequal, of course, the United States has lots of people paid absolutely miserable amounts of money, but it's more unequal than us. So it isn't necessary to have lots of people paid very little money. Right. Every other country in Europe manages to have a smaller income gap. The people at the bottom of the pile are often paid twice as much per hour than they're paid here for similar jobs. But they also remember their children are going to the same schools as other people's children. You know, there's no other European country that has a private sector like ours. We have a kind of an apartheid segregation system in Britain, where you can grow up and see and treat other people as if they're not like you, and hardly ever mix with them, or, you know, send your children to guides or scouts so they can mix socially, you know, because otherwise they wouldn't. And that isn't the common experience in somewhere like France or Germany. Oxford is twinned with a whole series of towns, and in Germany it's Bonn. And I once asked a school teacher from Bonn to rank the schools in Bonn, which are the good schools and which are the bad schools and where are the private schools. And he went, it took him ages. He went, well, there aren't really. He said, oh, the Beethoven Academy State School. He said that is actually where some of the conservative politicians slightly more likely to send their children. And then he said, "Oh, we do have one private school for slow boys." He said, "I think a member of your royal family went there." But now in Oxford, we have 6 state secondaries, and there's about £100,000 between each in terms of house prices for catchment areas. In the bottom one, only a few children go to university a year, hardly any. In the top one, hardly any children don't go to university. That's the difference. And that's the state sector. We then have a third of 15-year-olds going private.
Wow.
And inside the private sector, well, Kensington, Chelsea is half. London as a whole is 20%. And the private sector is even more divided than the state sector. There are, in effect, secondary moderns in the private sector for when you fail your entrance exam to some of the private schools. You've got your parents pay money for you to go to the private school for people who don't pass the exam. And it's enormous fear. It's enormous fear. It's not that we have people swimming in money, even though we've got this greater inequality, which makes it possible. People are absolutely bankrupting themselves so that their children don't go to the same school as their neighbours' children. You know, that is such a dysfunctional country.
Listen, I'm gonna bend to public pressure, because there's a whole series of questions which are related directly to a comment that you threw out very early in our conversation about what's wrong with our system of democracy. So in short order, I'm going to read you 2 or 3 questions, and you can choose to answer as many of them as you want, in whatever way you want. So Bruno Guillaume says, given what you've just said about the stated electoral system, if our votes don't succeed in changing the corrupted political system, what do we do? How do we move towards a more socially just society? That's one. Sky Stobart says, what do you think is a process that the UK should adopt to become a true democracy? Should we have PR? And I'm going to read Margie at the end. Is it ideological purity on the left that results in us being seen as divided and therefore less electable, whereas the right manages to present a more electorally attractive united front simply because they care less? Choose as many of those as you want.
Lovely. Let's start at the end. The right are very, very disciplined. Or, you know, if you don't behave in the hierarchy on the right, you're out. So they may have arguments, but they're in private. Why on earth would you have your arguments in public where the little people could hear what you were saying? You know, it's like arguing in front of the servants. You don't do that. So the arguments in the right are done in
Is private. That right? I mean, we are ruled by a guy who effectively threw his predecessor out of Theresa May out of a window, right? There was that extraordinary summer when they were all standing for her job.
Yes. Yeah.
They can be vicious when they want to be.
Oh, they can be. It was 11 or 12. And I remember checking the majority of them had actually been to an Oxford college who were standing. And the two final men were the 2 oldest Oxford men, Hunt and Johnson. So, you know, there are rules to how this works. They can be absolutely vicious when they want to be. And remember, Johnson chucked out, well, Winston Churchill's grandson.
Right, yeah, exactly, yeah.
Yeah, but you save that viciousness. You don't have a moany argument beforehand. You know, bang, he's out. The first thing you know, Johnson didn't say a single word in public against him until the point he threw him out.
Right.
So that's part of it. And the right has to be disciplined. Otherwise, it doesn't have a chance. Because if they argued in public, you know, should we get to a point where people are starving, or should we make sure they have a little bit of food? No, you know, I want them to have a little bit of food. No, I don't mind if their children starve. If they had that kind of argument in public, which they have in private, that's why we end up with people starving, because, you know, it wasn't by accident. They haven't got it, so they have to have that discipline. Going back to the first question, what do we do if our votes don't make a difference? I think in short term, we try to make our votes have a difference. So, you know, you do that. But but we also look at where is it heading? What happens when you have a government that constantly pushes up house prices, that makes promises to pensioners? And I suspect we're due to have a levelling down at some point. And if you like, I'm not in favour of saying that crises are going to come, but there comes a point when you have the highest house price acceleration in Europe and the most expensive housing in Europe and the lowest wages for a large number of people, and okay, the landlords can keep buying them up. And we have a third of our children in private rented now, having to move. So we could head back to a 90% rented society. It's just quite hard to imagine how that happens. And of course, and no future for the young, just paying rent. It's how do we stop them looking at other countries and seeing what's happening to them? So I suspect if we don't solve this through the ballot box, it will in effect be solved by a terrible economic crisis, which will then lead to a change in how people behave and vote, even with our system. And the third question about, how did we get here? One problem is that we developed a kind of European set of political parties without changing our voting system. So in the 50s and 60s, we just had two parties, Labour and the Conservatives, and a tiny rump of liberals, and no nationalists at all. And then we've added a Green Party. We had the SDP at one point. We have the nationalist parties. We have UKIP, or the Brexit Party comes along. So we have 6, 7 or 8 parties, but without the voting system that allows you to have 6, 7 or 8 parties. And that's a terrible mess to get into. I support John McDonnell on this. John McDonnell supports PR. You just need a pledge to introduce it. I don't particularly care which method of it it is. It in all its manifestations of PR is so different from this corrupt, if you can just get a minority of the electorate in the right places, you can have a massive majority system, that anything. And of course, once you've got a PR system in, you can tinker with it in other ways democratically, because your politicians will actually represent the people. They might not represent them as perfectly as you would like, but they'll represent them enough that if the system is not right, the system will be changed and tinkered again. And you could see that in other countries which have played that game.
Just to tie those 2 points that you made there about house prices and about the democratic system that we've got 2 main parties in this country. Neither of them is arguing for house price devaluation, right? Neither of them is saying that house prices need to come down, even though actually that might well prove to be quite a popular policy with lots and lots of people, especially people under 40. Is it? I wonder, in particular on house prices and asset values, whether there's something deeper than just the lack of political choice, whether it's so much a part of the British way of doing business, the British way of doing politics, that we just accept it, that house prices should always go up. As soon as you go into a crisis, what's the first thing you do? Stamp duty holiday, cut interest rates, whatever you need to do, keep the property market going.
Yes. Oh, and we've got many other schemes on the sidelines ready for any sign of a fall. So we really will. The system is geared up to absolutely push them to the maximum they can go. So when the fireworks go off, it's going to be spectacular. I would say it's kind of it's Japan 1989, 1990 style, is because if you have a system that says there's no concern at the moment about the speed of the increase in house prices,
right,
or the fact they rose through a pandemic,
right,
there's a cliff edge of stamp duty, but they'll delay that or something else. They'll do anything. Help to Buy was Osborne's biggest spending. So after Gordon Brown and your £20,000, Osborne guaranteed that the government would underwrite the first, whatever it was, 10% falls in house prices, so that the banks would lend. It was an enormous commitment to go. It's become vital because people don't have pensions they think they can live on. Their children are renting in middle age. Their grandchildren, if they go to university, which is half of them, have enormous debts, which, to insult them, some people won't call them a debt. It's even worse than having a debt is somebody telling you, oh, it's not a debt, it's a form of tax, you lucky person. So the house is the kind of lottery ticket, and it solves all kinds of problems. It's stability for the old age people. It's the next nest egg for the next generation. It's the insurance policy that they have. It makes up for wages being half in real terms what they used to be for many people in cities. And the great thing about it is it works like a lottery ticket in that you think it's worth this amount of money. And it is until the crash happens. And so you have all these people sitting there going, oh, look, it's I've got £500,000 in my 3-bed semi. And the only people who could actually pay £500,000 are landlords who will recoup by renting out at twice what a mortgage will be to your children. It's an amazing thing that happened, that we got ourselves into this situation where you can see it's not sustainable without mass immigration of people coming with enormous amounts of money to buy the housing. You can see it's not sustainable, but while it's working, we'll keep on doing it. And the number I see on Twitter at the moment, and it may show who I follow. I follow geography teachers. So I tell my geographers, I do follow loyally geography teachers. The number of geography teachers who are currently in the process of trying to buy a house in England, being gazumped, talking about how it has to happen quickly because we can't pay the stamp duty. Right. We're in a chain of 7 and something's, and I always say this with housing, I'm always predicting the crash to come. But there is a sense of panic out there amongst people trying to move who've got young kids and so on. And the idea that gazumping's going on while we have furloughing and the biggest economic crisis since the Second World War.
Yeah.
And that's the difference. Whereas, not to waffle on about this, we've forgotten. My grandfather bought a house in Leeds in the 1950s and it went down in value. And he wasn't upset because house prices hardly went up or down then. It wasn't something you thought of making money out of. My father, who is not profligate, who only ever bought third-hand mini cars, spent more money on cars in his lifetime, still alive, than housing. And we had a house because cars were a bigger expense than housing. And we've forgotten all of that. And you've got to be my age to know about the negative equity of 1990 and 91. And because of that forgetting, that's why we're in this current mad era of losing 500,000 people from the country, wages being lower,
right,
and some idea that we can carry on spending more and more and more on houses, that they will be our salvation in some way. And it's fascinating to watch, but it's absolutely terrifying for people who are in the middle of it. Imagine that you are going to spend a few £100,000 now on a 2-bed dodgy flat in Dalston Junction, for and you could have negative equity of 100,000, not the 2,000 or 3,000 that people had in the early 90s.
Mm.
Right. Aditya, do you have anything more to say before we wrap up?
No, I just want members of the audience to take away with them the prescription from Danny Dorling, that what we need is a good dose of negative equity. I think we can take that away as a headline, can't we, Danny?
We can. It won't be nice, but I think we shouldn't be shocked if and when it occurs, and it won't matter how much the Labour Party is arguing internally with itself at that point. Going back, last thing I'll say, I'll never forget a Guardian headline of a map. The map was entitled, it's 1992 or 1993. It was entitled "The Incredible Shrinking Tories," and it was a map of London that showed the Conservatives had lost control of a majority of outer London boroughs, because Conservative voters, when house prices fall, they don't walk to the polls. They stop voting. And that is what the Conservative Party know this, which is why they do everything to push the prices up. But, when people sort of say, how will we get great change? When we've got great change in the past, this has often occurred because of unexpected events, not engineered by politicians or by us.
Thank you very much. If ever there was a case for carrying on a conversation in a pub, it was here and now. And I am so frustrated that we cannot carry that on, because it was exhilarating and disturbing in equal measure. And a huge thank you to you, Danny, and to you, Aditya, for your time and energy tonight. I think if everyone's enjoyed it as much as I have, we will all be thrilled. So thank you both very much. And thank you to everyone who has taken the time to join us tonight. And we really hope that we will see you all in person again next year. As we draw to the end of the Dulwich Festival, I'd like to say a heartfelt thank you to the incredible Alpha Hopkins, our festival director, who's produced a virtual festival for a second year running, and to Rose Chapman, who made everything happen. And both of them have full-time jobs elsewhere. But there is still plenty to see for free on the festival website, which hosts podcasts, films, interviews, and the amazing work of many artists exhibiting on our virtual open house. So please do check the website and the social media channels for full details. But all that remains for me now is to say a huge, huge thank you to everyone who's been with us tonight. It's been fantastic. Cheers, and look forward to doing it again. Good night.
Good night. Thank you, Louise.
Thanks, Louise.